Tim Weiner, it's a pleasure to be here with you and your new book, Legacy of Ashes, which has just been published. It's an extraordinary study of the CIA. I've been covering the CIA off and on for over 30 years, and I don't know that a book like this has ever really been attempted, a comprehensive, systematic history of the agency. Maybe you could start our conversation by talking a little bit about how you came to undertake a book of this scope and how long it took you to do it.
Well, I've been covering CIA off and on. I've done other things since 1987. And it started out in kind of a marvelous way. I wanted to go to Afghanistan to see what American foreign policy during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan looked like from that end, the barrel of the gun. The United States was shipping hundreds of millions of dollars a year to the Islamic resistance of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan, who were fighting a brutal Soviet occupation. So before I went, I called CIA and said, I understand you people do country briefings sometimes for reporters who are going to exotic places. May I have one? Bill Casey had recently died, and Bill Casey didn't do those. He had cut them off. So they said, no, have a nice trip. Well, I did have a nice trip. It was a marvelous trip, a long trip. And when I came back from Afghanistan, I hadn't been back in Washington more than 36 hours before the phone rang. And it was CIA saying, hey, Tim, how'd you like to come in for that interview now? That was a two-way street, that discussion. So that was my first time entering the headquarters of CIA and sitting down face-to-face with CIA officers. And as you know, reporters and spies are not completely different from one another.
Many real similarities between the two lines of work. That's something that is clear to you and me as reporters, and I think is probably clear to a lot of intelligence professionals. One rule we should just say for people watching the show is that you know, this really is as similar as they are. These are oil and water. They don't mix. They shouldn't mix. It's really important for reporters, especially people like you who cover the agency, to keep a distance. But,
right.
So,
but
talk about. I mean, this is a great big book, and just, you know, it's sort of like thinking I'm going to climb Mount Everest. How did you decide that you were going to sit down and write a history? You hope the history of the CIA.
It wasn't that long ago, less than 3 years ago, when I began to feel that the amount of available documentation on CIA had reached a critical mass. My last book about CIA was all on the record, and I wanted this book to be all on the record. No anonymous sources, no blind quotes. If I quoted somebody, I wanted the person speaking, or I wanted to be able to cite something he or she had written. An old editor of mine, Gene Roberts, once said, great stories don't break, they ooze. And enough declassified documentation had at that point come out, and I had been writing about CIA, reporting on CIA, thinking about CIA for almost 2 decades, that I thought, I can do this now. There's enough material that I can put my hands on to write an on-the-record history.
I should say, as a reader who follows this subject, I was astonished by just how much has been declassified. You were quoting from documents that have been rumored to exist, but not only existed, but are now declassified and available to you. Did you have any fights with the agency in trying to get stuff available so you could use it, or maybe fights is the wrong word, any negotiations to try to pull stuff out so that it would be available?
No. The last really great history book about CIA was done 12 years ago by Evan Thomas. And Evan did negotiate with CIA and did get a rather painfully executed agreement whereby he could read some of the clandestine histories. No, I think it's a tribute to the transparency of American democracy that you could even write a book like this. A great deal has come out, not necessarily through CIA. The State Department, over the last 4 or 5 years, has put out an enormous amount of primary documentation on American foreign policy. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about CIA. The CIA executes American foreign policy. They have been since the early 60s, since the Bay of Pigs, acutely responsive to presidential command and control. And arguments about the CIA tend to be arguments about American foreign policy. During the Cold War, the left criticized the CIA for what it did. Ever since, the right has criticized the CIA for what it can't do. This is a part of the American government, CIA. We're Americans. This is an open democratic society. And the story of this book is how we have struggled for 60 years to run a secret intelligence service in an open American democracy.
We'll talk about the details of this story in a bit, but I wish you'd say a little bit more about the broad themes, because there's a way in which this book will be read, should be read, as an indictment of the CIA, of its performance over a very long period, of its inadequacy as our spy service. And just summarize for folks, if you would, what your conclusions are at the end of all this research you've done.
It is not unpatriotic to say we have to get better at this. The mission of CIA is to know the enemy. That is very difficult. But that is what it is called upon to do. And in order to know your enemy, you have to talk to your enemy and you have to spy on your enemy. We have magnificent technology to stare down from space and to eavesdrop on electronic communications, telecommunications. But the only way to know another man's mind is to talk to him. And this is the business of spies. You can't talk to the enemy, you can't spy on the enemy if you don't speak his language, if you don't know his culture. We as Americans are not good at this because we are an open democracy. This is not an indictment of CIA. The mission, I believe, is crucial to the United States.
But when I say indictment, I mean the performance of the cast of characters who've conducted this business for. Well, let me ask you to sum up then. What judgment would you give? Looking back at this 60-year story.
I will quote Richard Helms on this. Richard Helms was the director of Central Intelligence for 7 years under Presidents Johnson and Nixon. And before that, a career CIA officer, one of the founding fathers of CIA, and before that, with the OSS during World War II. And Richard Helms said, not one president, with the possible exception of George Bush the Elder, who after all ran the agency for about a year, not one president understood the first thing about the secret operations of the CIA. And in large part, this is a story of presidents who have misused and abused the CIA because they don't understand it.
A theme that runs through the book, which was fascinating to me, was the recurring tension between the CIA's information collecting, intelligence gathering role and its covert action role. Covert action, for viewers, is a reference to a kind of secret activity that really is meant to change other countries' political systems. We have paramilitary covert action where you send in secret armies. We have political covert action programs where we'll seek to bribe the politicians of another country. This is the part of the CIA's mission that seeks to overthrow governments that we don't like. And through your book, this tension between the two wings, between very colorful personalities on each side, comes up again and again. Maybe you just would talk people through that theme in the book.
When Harry Truman created the CIA 60 years ago, what he wanted was a newspaper. He wanted information consolidated from all sources available to the government of the United States and delivered to him each morning, so he wouldn't have to read a 2-foot stack of cables. Very quickly, the Cold War got very, very tense. The Soviets had been our allies during World War II. Without them, Hitler would not have been defeated. These two nations began to clash before the war was over. Joseph Stalin was an implacable, evil leader. Harry Truman was probably the opposite. We set out to know the world through the CIA, but the emergency of the Cold War and the emergency of the Korean War impelled us to try and change the world. Think of it as a spectrum. Here are the intelligence analysts. They mostly work at headquarters. They live in the suburbs of Virginia and Maryland. Here, and that is analysis. Well, who's going to get the information for them? The spies. That's espionage. They are overseas, stealing secrets, suborning people, in many cases paying for the information, buying it from foreign intelligence services, and sending it back to headquarters to figure out what it all means. And over here are paramilitary folks, are people who try and steal elections, swing elections, and that is war by other means. And that is the spectrum of what the CIA does. We're pretty good at analysis. The CIA got Vietnam less wrong, I think, than any other branch of the government. And we're really good at blowing things up, the best. What we're not good at is espionage.
And why do you think that's so? You could make an argument that espionage, reading other people's mail, artfully suborning people to commit treason against their countries, which is what spying is all about after all, is un-American. It just doesn't fit well with our national character. How much of it do you think is that simple problem?
I think that's the heart of it. We as Americans play by a set of rules that is the opposite of what espionage is. You know, we don't have a deep history of treachery and betrayal and screwing your enemies. We like to fight fair and square. The Russians had been at this for quite some centuries. The British had been at it for quite some centuries. And they knew the black arts better than we did. There's another aspect to this which I think is crucial. You cannot command, control, or contain a foreign country with people serving 2-year rotations. When the British ran an empire, they lived in the countries that they aimed to contain and control. I know a woman who was born in India in the 1930s, the 7th generation of her family, born in India, in the British Foreign Service and in the British Intelligence Service. You can't do that on 2-year rotations. If we as a nation aim to be a superpower, and we do, we are going to project our power overseas. To do that, you need to see over the horizon. That's the job of spies. And when intelligence fails, you get war, you get Korea, you get Vietnam, and you get Iraq, and soldiers die.
We'll get to Iraq, which is the kind of tragic conclusion that's looming as you turn the pages of your book. But to go back to the beginning, there's an argument that the CIA's problems originated in the fact that it was created, almost cloned from the British intelligence service, SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, that Wild Bill Donovan, the founder of OSS, was so much under British influence that he was, in some ways, a British asset. I won't use the word agent. There are some fascinating documents that a CIA historian named Thomas Troy found in which British officers are really crowing about the fact that they wrote the organizing charter for OSS. And you can make an argument that having been created in this British image in the beginning, and CIA really flowed out of OSS, we kept trying to act like the Brits But that was the basic problem, that they were better at running their kind of intelligence service than we were, and we never learned how to create and run our kind. Do you think that's fair?
I think that is a fragment of the story, and that is a story that has been told for some years. I think that CIA succeeded to the extent it did in the first 20, 25 years of its history because it had quite a number of people working for it who were from Central Europe, who were from Eastern Europe, who were from Russia, and who actually knew the countries that we were interested in because they had been born there. And they have names like Polgar and Seychelles and Rositsky, and they spoke many languages. They were, to steal a phrase out of context, rootless cosmopolitans.
But they were run by guys with names like Barnes and Wisner, and they were run by people who were not out of the ghettos of Eastern Europe, but out of the clubs of Manhattan.
A great deal has been made of the skull and bones patrimony of CIA. But what was good about the early CIA was, by and large, its ability to know the target countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and a great deal of that knowledge came from ethnic Central Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and Russians who worked for CIA. It came from a knowledge of the countries that we wanted to know.
Tim, some of the most famous, infamous actions of the CIA were the covert operations of the 1950s, the toppling of the Mossadegh regime in Iran, the coup in Guatemala. Talk about that period at the agency and the extent to which you think that, in a sense, contaminated the organization, sent it in a direction that was inappropriate and over the long run harmful.
The CIA didn't stick up its hand and say, let's go overthrow Guatemala. In the 50s, there was a great deal of interplay between the State Department and the CIA because the gentlemen who ran them were brothers. And
we should say John Foster Dulles at State and Allen Dulles running the CIA.
And so decisions about what to do abroad could be made over a cocktail by two men whose bond was blood. President Eisenhower was not clueless about secret operations. He'd run the greatest secret operation in American military history to help win World War II. And he believed that you were for us or against us. And if you were neutral, you were probably against us. John Foster Dulles believed that to the marrow of his bones. And so we set out across the world to change governments, convert people, and particularly in the Middle East, this became a fascinating business. President Eisenhower stressed to the Dulles brothers and to Frank Wisner that we should emphasize the holy war aspect of this, that we should support Islamic jihad against communism. And we did.
Probably not such a good idea in retrospect.
It was a black and white world, David. It was good versus evil. And the CIA was the pointy end of the spear of American foreign policy.
One thing that struck me, because I had never seen the declassified memos, was the degree to which President Eisenhower was suspicious, and that almost understates the degree of his wariness of the agency. Talk about Ike's CIA phobia, if you will.
Oh, I don't think he was phobic. I think he realized that he wasn't getting the truth from Allen Dulles. The title of Legacy of Ashes comes from a very recently declassified transcript of the last full-dress meetings of the National Security Council that President Eisenhower held in the days before he left office and handed over the presidency to John F. Kennedy. And Eisenhower was furious. And he said to Allen Dulles in front of everyone in his cabinet, Alan, I have been after you for 8 years to organize Central Intelligence, and you have failed me. I have fought an 8-year struggle, and you have handed me a defeat. And I will hand my successor, John F. Kennedy, a legacy of ashes. And 4 months later came the Bay of Pigs.
So let's talk about the Kennedys and the CIA. These stories are still the darkest, most mysterious ones in our country's modern history. I've never seen the story of the intelligence links to the Kennedy assassination told with more economy and clarity than you do in this book. So talk us through the really extraordinary story of the Kennedy brothers' obsession with Cuba after the failed coup attempt at the Bay of Pigs. And just take that story, if you would, through the assassination of President Kennedy.
Well, the Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion of Cuba of April 1961, is synonymous with failure, not just intelligence failure, but a snafu in which people die. And after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy...
And I mean, and the snafu, as you describe it, is that people were never really honest about what it would take to succeed. It's a haunting parallel to Iraq, one of many in your book, but people, at the agency never really leveled with the policymakers that air cover would be needed or this army would be stranded. You have one unbelievable detail that the maps they were using in the Bay of Pigs area had been made in, I think it's 1858, and they didn't show that it was, swampy ground from which you couldn't escape. Talk about that.
Have you ever been to the Bay of Pigs?
I have not.
I have. It is an impossible tangle of mangrove and mud with these hard-shelled, spiny crabs scuttling all around. It's impossible to imagine a more nightmarish place to do a landing. The leaders of the CIA, and specifically Richard Bissell, who was the chief of the clandestine service, knew that it was impossible that 1,500 men could go up against a very tightly disciplined 60,000-man army and take over Cuba. And yet, they went on. It's like that old song they used to sing about Vietnam, waist deep in the big muddy, and the big fool said to push on. When it was over, John Kennedy was furious. And he wanted to scatter the CIA to the four winds, break it up. And instead, he handed an unbelievable measure of control over American covert operations to the man he trusted most in the world, his 35-year-old brother, the Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby was enamored of the secret use of power, even more than his brother. But he didn't understand the first thing about it. And he lashed Richard Helms, who took over the clandestine service. Once Helms and I were talking over a beer, and Helms, who took over and ran the clandestine service for 5 years until he took over the CIA itself, and who was then 82 years old, offered to take off his shirt and show me the scars that he had on his back from being horsewhipped by Robert Kennedy. The Kennedys launched a new major covert action on average every 4.5 days during the 1,000 days of John Kennedy's presidency. And Bobby Kennedy was in control, and I use that word very loosely, of a lot of them. When John Kennedy installed a taping system in the Oval Office at the end of July 1962, and he switched it on, the first conversation recorded was about overthrowing the government of Brazil. And not every day, but very close to every day was a new action. Overthrow Guyana, great idea. Overthrow Haiti, okay. And the CIA's leaders, and Dick Helms, chief among them, would salute smartly and then go back to headquarters and say, good Lord, how am I going to do this?
Do you, thinking about the Kennedy era and the Camelot aura that it still carries, and about this misuse, gross misuse of secret power in the CIA, Do you think there is something to the idea that the Kennedys were almost romantic about the use, this idea that secret power could change the world and make it better? In other words, can you draw a line that connects the rhetoric of the Kennedy administration, this kind of dream we have of Camelot, with the things that were going on in the dark to try to make the world our way?
President Kennedy was a great fan of the James Bond novels by Ian Fleming. And he thought that's what it was like. And he promoted men at the CIA who were like James Bond, or at least outwardly lived like James Bond. It was a fantasy of power that you could snap your fingers and overthrow a country. And the deepest tragedy of this is that he decided that it would be a good idea to overthrow the president of South Vietnam, the country that we were desperately trying to support in the early 1960s against a ruthless communist enemy in North Vietnam. He set that in motion. He kept the United States one step removed from it, but he set that in motion. And there is a haunting tape of President Kennedy 3 days after Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was assassinated, talking to himself alone in the Oval Office and ruining the day he ever set a murder in motion. And 18 days later, he was dead. Richard Helms said this as a final judgment on these matters of the United States trying to kill Castro or overthrow Diem or set assassinations in motion. And Richard Helms said, Helms was not naive. This man had spent his life in CIA. Not only is it morally reprehensible, but if you try to kill their leaders, why shouldn't they try to kill yours?
Well, let's pursue that. First you mentioned the killing of Diem in Vietnam. Fellow spy novelist Charles McCary argued. Charles McCary was a CIA officer himself. Argued in a classic American spy novel called *The Tears of Autumn* that there was a link between this assassination of Diem, of a Vietnamese leader, and the assassination of President Kennedy. A lot of people at the agency who knew the secret that you're going to tell us in a minute, were convinced that this was an allegory and that McCary was really talking about the link between the Kennedy administration's efforts through the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro and the eventual assassination of President Kennedy. So take us, that story is very well told in your book, and just walk us through the remarkable story of how he tried to kill Castro and the possibility that President Kennedy was himself murdered in some way we still don't understand in response to that.
From the moment John Kennedy was assassinated to the end of his own presidency, Lyndon Johnson was convinced that the killing of John Kennedy was either an act of divine retribution for the murder of Diem or blowback from the attempt to kill Fidel Castro. The labyrinth that CIA wandered into after the murder of the president was profound and dark.
I'm gonna leave our audience entering that dark labyrinth, and we'll return to our second segment and a continued discussion of the link between the Kennedy assassination and actions in Cuba in a moment.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Tim Weiner and David Ignatius in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Janelle Henry, part of the political team here at C-SPAN. My job this year covering the presidential race is really exciting. We'll be crisscrossing the nation to bring you the very latest in political activities, campaign announcements, candidate speeches, and fundraisers. We'll give you an up-close look at how the candidates interact with the public as they seek support for their party nominations, the kind of unscripted moments you won't find anywhere else. And we won't just stop at the battleground states. We'll follow the race wherever it goes. For more information, check out our website at campaignetwork.org and click on our video archive section for past programs and political news.
The C-SPAN networks, providing you access to public affairs on television, radio, and on the web. Book TV invites you to visit our new enhanced website, www.booktv.org. Recently redesigned, we've added more information, a new look, and made it even easier for you to use. Stop by booktv.org for more about book fairs, book TV news, and bus events. Or check out the full weekend schedule for a new schedule printing feature, or to watch video online. Let us know what you think. Send emails to online@cspan.org.
Afterwards with Tim Weiner and David Ignatius continues.
We're back with Tim Weiner, who's the author of a remarkable new history of the CIA called Legacy of Ashes, and we are going to continue our conversation where we left it off. We were entering, Tim, this dark and mysterious question of the Kennedy assassination and the CIA's efforts to kill Fidel Castro. Tell us a little bit about that story and then about what happened afterward.
The roots of this story lie at the end of the Eisenhower presidency, when CIA was authorized, although there's nothing on paper, to get rid of Castro in a political sense, not to kill him. After the Bay of Pigs, in the spring of 1961, the stakes went up. And though, again, there is nothing on paper, there is no question that Bobby Kennedy oversaw more than one mission to kill Fidel Castro, to murder him. The CIA, which has a military ethos, believed it was acting under a lawful order from the commander-in-chief, and saluted smartly, and then sort of buried its face in its hands and said, "Oh Lord, now what?" The chemists came up with poison pills. They never got there. The mafia was enlisted to get the poison pills or to put a thug next to Castro and blow his head off. Nothing worked. And finally, in the last days of President Kennedy's life, dashing Desmond Fitzgerald, the man most like James Bond in the CIA. He drove a Jaguar. He lived in a beautiful house in Georgetown. Made a contact, a face-to-face contact, with a Cuban major who did not like Fidel Castro at all. And they talked about murder weapons, rifles, telescopic sights, silencers. And they were meeting. They were meeting at the moment.
Said that he was there. I think your book says he was there on behalf of Robert Kennedy. Is that right?
He said he was sent as an emissary of Bobby Kennedy, which was dangerously close to the truth, if not the whole truth itself.
And shortly thereafter, President Kennedy is killed in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, a man who we know had defected to the Soviet Union, but arguably more important, had been at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City seeking to go to Cuba, who'd had all sorts of involvement with Cuba issues. In your own mind, Tim, what is your judgment about whether there is in fact a link between the CIA's efforts to kill Castro, which are clear and documented, and the murder of JFK?
There's no evidence to connect the CIA to the murder of an American president. And the thought is so abhorrent that it's difficult to even speak. But Lyndon Johnson believed that there was a direct connection, that Kennedy was trying to kill Castro, but Castro got to him first.
I didn't mean to suggest that the CIA killed Kennedy, which I think is preposterous, but that Castro, knowing that we were going after him, decided to go after our president. Do you, in a scale of 0 to 100, what level of credence would you give that?
What's crucial is that in the minutes and hours and days and weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy, the CIA had a mountain of leads, pieces of circumstantial evidence that very strongly suggested that Lee Harvey Oswald was a Cuban agent or a Soviet agent. And it really, the question admits only two proofs. Either the communists tried to kill Kennedy or they didn't. And either Lee Harvey Oswald got off 1,000,001 shot with a mail-order rifle or he didn't. And Richard Helms, who had to pursue this question from November 1963 for the next decade, said the question would always be an open book.
And in your mind, you're the historian. What's your judgment? I keep trying to get you to declare on this.
My judgment is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but that there is absolutely no strong proof that takes you down the road that the Soviets or the Cubans killed Kennedy. When the Soviet and Cuban files are opened, if they are ever opened, we will know.
I'll mention one brief anecdote that sticks in my mind on this subject. Like you, Tim, I talked fairly often with Richard Helms, who had been director of the CIA. And in the late 1980s, I was the editor of the Washington Post's opinion section called Outlook. And in that capacity, I commissioned an article that discussed, in part for the first time, the remarkable link in time between Des Fitzgerald's meetings in Paris with the Cuban agent, I think his name was Rubella, and the subsequent Kennedy assassination. And I got a phone call after it was published from Helms, and he was furious. And he thought he would, it was a very unusual, this was one of the most calm and reasoned men I ever, he was a gentleman's gentleman and a remarkable man. And one of the heroes of this book, I think, but I want to talk about that in a minute. But here he was on the phone, and he was really upset that we had published this. And I will always think that Dick Helms had this awful, gnawing fear that it was conceivable, remote but conceivable, that there was a connection. And he didn't like to see that connection explored in print as we did in this Outlook article. What did you talked often with Dick Helms. Did you have that same feeling that this ate at him a little bit?
I think the uncertainty over whether there was a Soviet conspiracy to kill Kennedy or a Cuban conspiracy ate at him mightily. When you come to understand a little bit about men like Dick Helms, men like Frank Wisner, men like Des Fitzgerald, who were the best and the brightest of CIA from the late 40s onward, the killing tension of their lives is unbearable. Frank Wisner died by his own hand at 56. Des Fitzgerald dropped dead of a heart attack at 56. What killed them was the Cold War and the tension of prosecuting it.
Talk about Dick Helms. I said a moment ago that I thought he was in some ways a hero of this book, in part because he wasn't swept away. He was a kind of classic establishment figure, hair not out of place, always perfectly dressed. But there was a way in which he had the intelligence collection instincts of an FBI man. In fact, Helms tended to lean in the agency. As you know, there was the kind of preppy camp, and there was the ex-FBI guy camp. And Helms, interestingly, often leaned with the ex-FBI guys. And I'm wondering whether, in this story, you have many people who really didn't get the job done. You're pretty honest and tough in your judgments about them. But turning the pages, I felt that you basically had a fondness for Helms.
And I'll tell you why. Apart from whatever personal feelings I had about being in the presence of a man 40 years older than I who had lived through every turn of the road of the Cold War. What Dick Helms stood for was espionage, spying, getting the information. You'll remember that Dick Helms was also once a newspaperman, a wire service reporter. What people like Wisner and people like Des Fitzgerald, and I should add people like Bill Casey, who was first Ronald Reagan's campaign manager and then his CIA director, stood for was the quick fix, silver bullets. Covert action without intelligence is a fool's errand, and we have gone on that errand time and again. And what Dick Helms stood for was intelligence. And if there is an argument in this book, it is that action without knowledge is fatal. Dick Helms stood for knowledge.
Dick Helms also was a man, like every CIA director, who faced an awful lot of pressure from presidents. And he faced pressure in particular in the years really surrounding Watergate, in which President Nixon, who was a conspiratorial, talk about a man who loved covert action, who wanted to use the CIA, misuse the CIA, and it's argued really tried to lay off the Watergate scandal on the CIA.
He did.
How well do you think Dick Helms resisted that pressure?
He fought it tooth and nail, up to the point where he believed he had received a lawful order from the president. There was an excruciating 16 days after the Watergate break-in, where the president is clearly obstructing justice for which he was driven from office, that particular crime, trying to use a specious argument of national security to get the CIA to call off the FBI, which was investigating a federal crime of wiretapping at the Democratic National Committee headquarters here in Washington. That crime had been committed by 6 CIA veterans, 2 veteran officers, and 4 veteran Cuban agents. And so Nixon, in his mind, said, well, maybe I can make this argument plausibly. These are all ex-CIA guys. For 16 days, Helms wavered. Had he fallen, the CIA would have been destroyed, along with Richard Nixon. But in the end, he pulled himself up and he said no to the President of the United States, a word for which he was cashiered some months later.
We then move into the period that we've been reminded of in the last week with the public release of the so-called family jewels, the unspeakable crimes of the CIA, unspeakable never to be revealed, and here they are. You can go to the website, CIA website, and look at them now. Talk about that period of revelation of CIA misdeeds by the Church Committee in the Senate and by the House Intelligence Committee. You know, there's an argument that some partisans of the CIA make that so weakened, so knocked the CIA off balance, made it so difficult for the CIA to be reconstituted as an effective secret intelligence agency that it's never really come back. I suspect you don't buy that argument, but explain why.
The so-called crimes of the CIA, with very few exceptions, were the fault of presidents. Do you think the CIA stuck up its hand and said, gee, it would be a great idea to kill Fidel Castro? No, it did not. Presidents order the CIA to do what it does. And the CIA takes the fall. The only lasting crime, the only crime of consequence that the CIA has committed is to fail to keep presidents fully informed about what's going on in the world.
Well, that certainly is a theme that resonates as we think about Iraq. Let's continue with this story. Sometimes reading your book and seeing all the mistakes both in presidential direction and sometimes in execution of policy by the agency, you wonder, how did we ever win the Cold War? Give us your sense of that. I mean, talk a little bit. You say that the CIA likes to claim that its successes are secret and its failures are trumpeted, and you say at one point it has precious few successes. But at the end of the day, we did win the Cold War. And tell us what role you think the CIA played in that extraordinary result in the end.
The CIA spent a great part of the first 15 years of its existence, from the late 40s to the early 60s, flinging foreign agents over the Iron Curtain with parachutes, flinging them over the bamboo curtain of Red China, flinging them into North Korea, hammering to no end whatsoever except the deaths of thousands of foreign agents, at an attempt to understand what was going on in these secretive police states that were our enemies, our mortal enemies. At the end of that, in the early 1960s, the CIA helped create spy satellites. Satellites that are 22,000 miles above the Earth and look down and can count armies, tanks, missiles, and that helped keep the Cold War cold. The Soviet Union was not that hard a target, it turned out, because the Soviet Union was like a mountain. The power structure was like a triangle with one man on top, and then 2 and 4 and 6 and 8 and 12 until you got to several million. And it was static. It didn't move, the Soviet Union. Whereas the enemy today is flat and it moves like a river, and we can't see the currents underneath from space. The CIA was steadfast in contributing to arms control by accounting for the power of the Soviet military, and especially its nuclear forces. The CIA never had a great spy inside the Kremlin.
Even Penkovsky is cited. Oleg Penkovsky is cited. It was been called the spy who saved the world because he provided timely intelligence before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think that's hype?
You know who saved the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was John McCone. John McCone was the director of Central Intelligence that Kennedy hired after he fired Allen Dulles. And an amazing man, really. A fiery anti-communist, a conservative Republican from California, a man who'd made a fortune building ships during and after World War II. John McCone, alone in the American government, said, the Soviets are going to put nuclear missiles into Cuba. And he walked alone in his councils. No one believed him. The CIA as an institution rejected the idea, and the Kennedy White House said that's preposterous. Finally, McCone argued, you've got to put a U-2 up there. And they did, and by God, the Soviets were putting missiles into Cuba. If John McCone had not done that, it would have been a fait accompli, it would have been a done deal. And we would have faced a nuclear standoff beyond our imagination.
I am old enough to remember not simply watching on television as President Kennedy displayed those U-2 photographs of the suspected sites, missile sites in Cuba, but to remember before the display of those photographs, my father, who was working at the Pentagon as a civilian, being unusually skittish. I mean, in a way that, kids can read their parents. And you knew something was up, and he was staying at the office sometimes almost all night. That was in the period when they were thinking of invading Cuba, and they were assembling the army that would do it. But again, when we think about this story of the Cold War, this long battle that defined the careers of Dick Helms and so many at the CIA, do you think that they should take a kind of credit for that victory, or do you think in the end the Soviet Union was just a big, overripe thing that just fell of its own accord? It wasn't the CIA pushing, it fell of its own accord.
Soviet communism was a rotten system. And I think there's little evidence, some, but not much, to support the idea that we won the Cold War because we spent $1 trillion more on weaponry, or because we knew that we had picked the Kremlin's pocket and we knew their next move. The people who were running the Soviet Union by the late 1980s were old, vain, foolish men who believed their own propaganda. And that is why the Soviet Union fell.
I would amend that only as follows. The group that came in at the end, starting with Yuri Andropov, knew how bad it was. Yuri Andropov had been head of the KGB, and the KGB did know the truth. They knew that the Soviet Union was desperately behind.
But did they tell the Politburo?
Well, you know, the reason the Soviet Union began to change sharply and suddenly in the 80s was, I think, a kind of internal coup by the KGB, initially led by Andropov. I was going to Moscow in that period for the Wall Street Journal, and later led by Andropov's man, Gorbachev, you know, who was desperate to reform Soviet communism, thought it was possible. And of course, we now know every move he made to reform it, to open it up through glasnost, just made the job of dismantling it easier. But I do think that had it not been these KGB sort of internal reformers, if that's the right word, I don't want to say that the Soviet system would still be intact today, but it would have been a heck of a lot harder to have the end game.
Yeah. It was a rotten system, and we're well shut of it.
I think on that there would certainly be agreement. I want to get to Iraq, which, as I said earlier, looms over this book as the kind of tragic finale of this story, and in a sense is the prism through which our generation will see the CIA. But before I get to Iraq, I want to ask you a question that kept recurring in my mind as I read Legacy of Ashes, and that is, what do you think we still don't know? You know a lot. You know, you've spent years now researching this subject, and you've written what appears to be a quite comprehensive history, but you're in a better position than most to say what you think we don't know. And so talk about that.
Well, there are, as Don Rumsfeld used to say, known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and I can't tell you about the latter. We know why our intelligence system failed in producing a considered judgment that Saddam Hussein had an arsenal bristling with chemical and biological weapons, and that this justified, in effect, a preemptive war against Iraq in 2002 and 2003. That failure was because the freshest intelligence the CIA had was 4 or 5 years old. What we don't know, and what we may never know, is the interactions between CIA, the White House, and state in the preceding year. The President of the United States, George W. Bush, turned the powers of American intelligence on in ways that they hadn't been turned on for 30 or 40 years, training them inside the borders of the United States, and also pushing the CIA to serve as kind of a paramilitary police, abducting people, assassinating people, throwing them in prisons. That is a misuse of the CIA. That is not what the CIA was created to do, and in order to do it, they've had to second, special operations commandos from the American military. It's extraordinary that this president and his relationship with the CIA, who, after all, have renamed their headquarters the George Bush Center for Intelligence, after the president's father, has been so strained. In 2004, the president was asked a question in public. So what did the CIA tell you about what life would be like in Iraq post-Saddam? And the president said, Well, they said it could be bad, they said it could be good, they said it could be all right. They were just guessing. Now, just guessing is not intelligence.
Well, now, Tim, on that question, I wonder if the CIA doesn't deserve a little bit more credit. As I read this story, they did warn with some specificity before the invasion about the danger of ethnic conflict, and through 2003 and 2004, when the White House was insisting everything was going great, chiefs of station sent increasingly sharp warnings.
And the president said, "What is this guy? Some kind of a defeatist?"
Exactly. They were prepared to reject the warnings of these. So, aren't we being a little harsh in saying these were just this was the gang that couldn't shoot straight and didn't know anything?
Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense for the first 6 years of this administration, and Dick Cheney, the Vice President, had been dealing with CIA for quite a number of years, going back to the Nixon and Ford administrations. They were, to put it politely, skeptics about the CIA's ability to know the world. During the first Gulf War in 1991, the CIA discovered that Saddam did indeed have an underground program to build nuclear weapons, but they discovered it long after the war was over. And Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense at that point, said, we blew up everything that we knew about in Iraq during the Gulf War, and we didn't know about this. I will never trust the CIA again. And he never has. And that has been hugely influential on the president, whose father, after all, was one of the greatest supporters the CIA has ever had. It is not un-American or unpatriotic to say we have to do better. Look, the CIA's IT, its information technology, is terrible, and that's by the CIA's own internal reports. 50% of the people of the workforce at CIA today are new. They have less than 5 years experience. And by the CIA's own standard, they're not good to go overseas. They're not ready. They're trainees. We as a nation have to do better at this.
So let's, in concluding, Tim, let's talk a little bit about what the intelligence service that America needs might look like. Based on your reading of this history that's told in Legacy of Ashes, what do you know that other people ought to about how that intelligence service might be reconstituted?
A decade ago, it was 10 years ago this week, Dick Helms looked me in the eye mournfully. The CIA's 50th anniversary was about to happen. And he said, the only superpower in the world doesn't have enough interest in what's going on in the world to run an espionage service. And he kind of threw up his hands in despair. That was 10 years ago, and things haven't improved very much. If we want to get good at this, and I think the national survival of the United States might depend on it, because we are in an intelligence war that may last as long as the Cold War.